On December 14th, 1961, there is a robbery in Mont-Laurier. Armed criminals enter Mr. and Mrs. Grenier's apartment located above their general store. They steal $4,000. That evening, Rejean Hinse, a Montreal resident, could not foresee that he would be sentenced to 15 years in prison for this robbery he did not commit. Rejean Hinse's story is above all the story of a man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was the victim of an imbroglio created by a police officer of the Mont-Laurier division of the Sûreté du Québec who wanted to protect his reputation, and Hugues Duval, the robbery instigator, his partner in a pyramid scam of chain letters. Nearly 50 years later, Rejean Hinse, a man hurt by a destiny that was not supposed to be his, is still pursuing his quest for justice.
Mr. Hinse is a person who has suffered an important trauma in the 60s that has really created a change in him and his life. Mr. Hinse lived that change without making a choice, entirely by chance, by being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
There's no need for a psychological evaluation of Mr. Hinse to know that anybody would have tremendously suffered from such things. This is the type of thing that justifies our attempts to correct him as much as possible.
Rejean Hinse's story is one of a man who had a hard life.
Since he's a Duplessis orphan, he's not had an easy life. He already had a difficult start in life. His mother chose his sister over him.
At the time, his father deserts the army, leaves his wife and 2 children, leaving them without support or revenue.
My mother found herself alone with 2 young children. I was 3 years old. My sister was 6 months old.
His mother, unable to provide for both her children, entrusts the orphanage with Rejean.
Some orphans were really orphans, well, from birth, but they had not experienced maternal love. That's what I had known. At 3 years old, when you lose that link, that holds you to life. It's a terrible, terrible shock.
It was already unfair that he was at the orphanage, knowing he had a mother.
She took me to the photographer to take a beautiful photo because she knew it was probably the last photo she would have of her son. It's the only photo I have from my childhood, the first memories I have from my childhood. Around that age, 3, I was crying all the time.
When he got out of there, he met my mother, she got pregnant, and he finds himself in prison.
Shortly before the event in Mont-Laurier, Rejean meets Janine in Montreal, who will become his wife and the mother of his 2 children.
When I met her, she was 16, and me, I was 23. It was a great love I was discovering.
Since he goes through an unemployment period in the plumbing field and to support his future family, he buys used cars, repairs, and resells them.
I found that easy, to buy a car, to refurbish it, and try to sell it with a profit. Salesmen, for them, if you could purchase 2 or 3 cars at the same time, old beaters that were at the end of the used car lot, oh, they were happy.
Winter coming, Rejean wants to finalize one of his 2 Cadillac sales. On December 4th, 1961, he sells a used Cadillac to Laurent Beausoleil, a sale that would change the course of his life.
Laurent Beausoleil is one of the last cars I sold. It was a Cadillac. I had 2 Cadillacs. One I used, and the other was for sale. It was a car that looked very good for the body, but the engine was pretty tired. At one point, Beausoleil, who lived in my area, it was interesting. He was taking the car with a trial option for 1 week and would come back with the car after 1 week. He was either going to buy the car or return it to me. Barely a few days later, he drove up to Mont-Laurier, and the car, the engine broke. He had to leave the car almost in Mont-Laurier, at the Lac des Écorces, which is approximately 10 kilometers from Mont-Laurier. After that, I was 2 weeks without a single word from him, because at the end of the week, when he was supposed to return the car to me, I didn't see him. I was unable to reach him. He came himself. When I found out that the car was in Mont-Laurier, alone, I was angry, because I could not have imagined that we would have gone so far with a car that was pretty tired. I didn't want to lose money with that car. So I said I wanted to go to Lac des Écorces to see in what state the car was. The reason I was insisting that much for Beausoleil to be with me, it was because he had some responsibilities towards that car. He was the one who left the car there. Myself, I had never been to Mont-Laurier. It was an area that was completely unknown to me. When we got to Lac des Écorces, I introduced myself to the mechanic, and he says that I need a release to take possession of this car. The mechanic offered to come with me to Mont-Laurier, and Beausoleil, he decided to... Next door there was a snack bar next to the garage. You know, there was a small restaurant, so he decided to wait there. I went to Mont-Laurier with the mechanic, who directed me to the police station that was within the Court of Justice building. There, I introduced myself to the corporal, who went to the chief's office to get a release form. He puts his form in the typewriter and starts to type my name. But he asks for my driver's license and registration. I gave him my license, and the mechanic intervenes to say that the registration was in his garage's office. This is absolutely necessary to fill the form, the car registration. So he asks us to return to the garage to go and get the registration.
On the way between Mont-Laurier and Lac des Écorces, the mechanic Leclerc tells Rejean that some people showed up at his garage in early December. One of them, Hugues Duval from Mont-Laurier, asked him permission to leave his broken-down car on his land. Fearing that the Cadillac had been stolen, he feels obligated to contact the Mont-Laurier police.
A few days went by, and the mechanic, looking in the car, found the registration in the name of Rejean Hinse. This did not correspond to Hugues Duval, but he did not know Hugues Duval. He was a guy from Mont-Laurier.
Three months before the robbery, Hugues Duval and Laurent Beausoleil are stopped by the police while they make a reconnaissance at the general store in view of performing the robbery. The police let them go. Later, Duval decides to not actively participate in the robbery, but he gives the apartment and the general store's plans to Beausoleil in exchange for a percentage of the proceeds of the robbery. Moreover, Duval informs Beausoleil that Mr. Grenier's son wants to sell his towing truck, information that allowed Beausoleil to have Mr. Grenier open the door for him. One week after Duval and Beausoleil left the Cadillac with the mechanic, that is 4 days before Rejean Hinse arrives for the first time in the Mont-Laurier area, the robbery is committed in the apartment above the general store. Robbery instigated by Hugues Duval, and to which Beausoleil and other accomplices actively participate. Once the owners were controlled, the thieves, with the plan provided by Duval, looked for the money everywhere in the apartment.
Oh,
1 hour of terror, during which the thieves have not been gentle with their victims. Following the thieves' departure, Mr. Grenier takes a few minutes to free himself from his bonds and calls the police right away. Rejean Hinse, back at the police station with the mechanic, this time with the Cadillac's registration, only wants to get the official papers allowing him to recover his car. Rejean has no idea he will be accused of robbery and that his life will be turned upside down.
We take the registration, we return to Mont-Laurier, and suddenly, arriving in this big room that was the Sûreté du Québec headquarters in Mont-Laurier, there's about 10 policemen and some prisoners. The chief addressed me, telling me, "You will place yourself in the center here." At first, I'm dumbstruck, and I think they want to identify prisoners. It was obvious. They were inmates. They were all dressed identically. That's all, he said. It was for me to take place in the lineup. He brings 2 people in, the 2 people that were in his office, and makes them sit on the 2 chairs that are there. A man and a woman, victims of an aggravated theft committed the previous week. The 2 people sitting and Monsieur Bourgeois, everybody stares right at me. At the last minute, the police chief takes a hat and comes right in front of me and tells me, "You're gonna put that hat on." But I'm starting to feel stunned by what's happening and I hesitated. He pulled it right down on my head. I'm in no position to protest. I'm wondering what's happening. I'm like intimidated, humiliated, and I feel a little ashamed in front of all these eyes on me. After some time, Bourgeois makes us turn right. We turn like that, a complete turn on the right. Wait a little, a few seconds, and on the other side, again. Wait a few seconds, and face on. Then he asks us in turn to identify ourselves, and I think also there was a short sentence to repeat. Turn the light off and go upstairs.
Turn the light off and go upstairs. Turn the light off and go upstairs.
After that identification lineup, Bourgeois sends the inmates back to their cells and orders me to wait, sitting on a chair just in front of his office. He lets Mr. and Mrs. Grenier in his office. Conrad Bourgeois opens the door and asks me to come into his office. Monsieur Bourgeois orders me, always direct commands, to look Monsieur Grenier straight in the eyes. So I turn to Monsieur Grenier, look him in the eyes, then Mrs. Grenier. Then he tells me to get out and wait again on the chair. I get out, take my seat back on the chair, and wait a good 5 minutes at least before he gets out and tells the policeman to take me down to the cells. Then I want to intervene, and you don't understand anything, and 2 policemen get next to me and grab me by the arms, and that's how they took me down to the cells. Then I was in the cell, apart from the others. During that time, the policeman went to get Beausoleil and brought him back, and we had another identification lineup with the same prisoners, the same policemen, and they took me back upstairs and put me in a 3rd lineup. After that lineup, they take me downstairs again to that cell. I asked to make a phone call. I asked to see a lawyer, and the only answer I get is that the chief is the one to decide. I cannot even call my wife. I cannot even call my mother or anyone. I cannot contact anybody. So obviously my wife must be very worried because we're together every day. I was 3 days in that cell without seeing a lawyer, without seeing anybody aside from the guards who brought me food. And after the third day, that's when I was interrogated by 2 policemen. The interrogation must have lasted 20 minutes to half an hour. Until then, I didn't know what I could be suspected of. That's when they told me that a robbery had taken place the previous week and that I was suspected of it.
While he's imprisoned in Mont-Laurier, trying to understand what is happening to him, Rejean gets important information from the other inmates about the robbery and the lineups.
After the interrogation, they took me down to the cells with the other prisoners. That's when I learned a little more about what happened. That the civilians present were 3 policemen, and Mr. and Mrs. Grenier knew all these people since, according to what they were telling me, they owned a general store. The way I addressed to them, they realize I have never come to Mont-Laurier. I am wrongly accused. They are the ones trying to help me. But in truth, the policemen are the ones who should have tried to help me.
After some long days waiting in his cell, Rejean finally meets a lawyer.
On Friday night, around 7 o'clock, a lawyer arrives, Henri Courtemanche. He asks me, what happened? I tell him in details what I had just been through since the 18th. I claim my innocence. It's the first time I set foot in Mont-Laurier, and I'm accused of something I have nothing to do with. After telling him, as if I trusted him, he asks me what I thought about him taking my case. I was surprised. I was surprised because my intention had always been to contact a lawyer I knew in Montreal. So I asked him a few questions, and he answers that he's a lawyer from Mont-Laurier, that he had been a member of Parliament for 10 years. When he told me that, I thought, he's a leading expert here. He was saying, listen, I can guarantee that everything will sort itself in this. In the end, I asked him one other question, a little to make sure, despite all the insurance he was trying to give me by taking my case, he crossed his forefinger and middle finger like this. I'm like this with the judge who conducts cases here. So I agreed. I agreed for him to represent me as my lawyer. I told him, listen, I've been here 5 days, and I've been unable to see anybody. I have not been able to contact anybody. It would be time for me, at least, to contact my wife. So right after that, I was authorized to finally call my wife.
His 3 months pregnant wife is shocked.
Her too. She must have been stunned at first, because there was a huge moment of silence. Incomprehensible, because I let her know, slowly, that I was accused of aggravated theft, committed the previous week, the 14th. I spent the Christmas season in jail. I got a $5,000 bail to be released, which my mother provided for me. So I got out. When I'm out, I'm trying to find people who obviously saw me that infamous day of December 14th. But then, we're after Christmas season. It's early January. So it's difficult to make people remember from places that you've frequented. I'm obviously looking for people for my alibi, whom I could presume would consent at the right time, if necessary, to testify. So I get in touch with people. I tell them what happened to me in Mont-Laurier, and I ask them if they would be able to testify for me in proof of alibi. What these people ask me is, why have you been accused? What happened? How can you have been accused of something that happened 200 kilometers from here? From one to the other, just like that, I realized that by telling them, I was actually scaring them more than anything else, because they could see themselves in a situation where the police could suspect them if they testified for me.
In 1961, Rejean Hinse, wrongly accused of a robbery committed in Mont-Laurier while he was in Montreal, spends the whole holiday season in jail before being released on bail. His preliminary inquiry, later qualified in 1990 as rotten by the Quebec Police Commission, bore many anomalies. Only the robbery victims were interrogated. It took 2 years after his arrest for Rejean Hinse to get before the judge. Many important witnesses, of which some of the theft perpetrators could have exonerated him, but none of them was asked to testify. A trial where the culprit's identity was presumed.
The presumption of innocence at the start was clearly a presumption of guilt. That was clear. The presumption of innocence never existed in my case. I was like a spectator who more or less observes what is happening. During the trial, obviously, we recount once again. Like in the preliminary hearing, what happened in that house and the theft, what the people did, okay. But me, how to make links. I was not even there. At the trial, some witnesses were assigned. For the Crown, there was Mr. and Mrs. Henriot-Grenier. My witnesses are André Legault, Raymond Séguin, and Jeannine Hamelin, my wife, and myself. André Legault was one of my witnesses who had an important evidence to present in court. At that time, I had sold him a car. He had asked me to write a receipt, and I wrote that receipt, and he holds a proof of my presence in Montreal on December 14th, 1961.
The alibi is not considered, and the lawyer does not manage to defend him.
His lawyer was not really there. He was not present as he would have liked.
Courtemanche, in there in court, did not really try to help me. At the trial, I was always expecting him to ask the appropriate questions to the witness Grenier about the police lineups. But they managed. This is also part of the conspiracy. Managed to absolutely find me guilty because all these people did not want to look bad. The witnesses assigned who were supposed to testify did not testify. I was accused, I was guilty. Since you are accused, you are identified, but in which circumstances? Come on. That is what he should have said during the trial, and they made sure this whole aspect would be ignored.
A trial where the 3 illegal police lineups were never brought up, and where a policeman committed perjury, where authorities used evidence from Laurent Beausoleil's trial to accuse Rejean Hinse, errors that led Rejean Hinse to jail.
Incredible, I'm telling you, things that come from total aberration. And without my alibi, they found some flaws related to the testimonies between the witnesses to find me guilty and sentence me to 15 years in prison. In court, when the judge sentenced me, all I could do was cry, because my life turned. At that moment, when I'm wrongly accused of that, that's when I'm not the same man I was, and I have to bear a burden that does not belong to me.
His trust in the state, in the authorities, whether it is the police, the legal system, lawyers, his employer, anybody in position of authority, he used to trust at the time that the truth would be revealed and that his nightmare would end. But it hasn't been the case.
The very next day, I was transferred, not to the penitentiary, but to Bordeaux. Because there's a law that existed that said that if you signed the agreement for the sentence you received, the guilt, you sign that form and you're immediately transferred to the Saint-Vincent-de-Paul penitentiary. Otherwise, you're 15 days in the hole at Bordeaux. Bordeaux was not easy at the time. So there I am in the hole at Bordeaux. Obviously, you don't want to sign that paper. A cell completely naked, lying on a spring, not even a mattress, one blanket, that's it.
What Rejean Hinse ignored is that the police officer in charge of his arrest had done everything to save his reputation and made sure his partner in a fraud business could never be accused.
Duval was a guy from Mont-Laurier who's into a variety of things, among them the illegal chain letters, for whom Conrad Bourgeois becomes promoter for the Mont-Laurier area. Conrad Bourgeois had been caught in various things, like illegal chain letters. He had been reported by some citizens, of which Bruno Aubry, who was the chief of the municipal police, and has afterwards been put under investigation and was demoted from detective sergeant and was returned to the corporal rank. He had to rebuild his name afterwards. And Conrad Bourgeois, he used me as a scapegoat to rebuild his name. After Bordeaux, I was transferred to the penitentiary, and the Saint-Vincent-de-Paul penitentiary is. Me arriving there, it's hell. And there, you're stuck, sentenced to 15 years. 15 years there. Hell on earth. And then you're ashamed of being a human being. I had to rebuild myself as a human being. I was completely shattered. I started taking charge, I believe, by forcing myself. I started impossible workouts, burning myself out with exercises, especially in my cell. And then, in the yards, on the weights, I was going above my strength, trying to evacuate that rage. But it was not a matter of evacuation. I was cultivating the hatred, the rage, the revolt. And that's what helped me to not get out of it, but to live what I had to live there. There was one other thing. I had such violent headaches. Now, I wasn't seeing a doctor anymore. And how to overcome that atrocity that I had to live. Oh, these headaches, they were unbearable, and they were not ordinary headaches. But do you know how I found relief? It was, well, there were big stone walls. It was to hit my forehead hard enough on the walls so it would hurt more than the headaches. And then I had a slight relief. The other three, who were never accused of the case in Mont-Laurier, were accused of other acts, like bank robbery. They had been sentenced to 10 years, so they were at the penitentiary for 10 years. So I ended up in the penitentiary for something of which I was innocent, but I had to live with the people who had committed the robbery in Mont-Laurier. Try to imagine which state I was in. Even for them, some of them that I got to know little by little, I could represent a danger to them. And over there was a lot of self-justice at the time. And something could have happened to me. And the ones who had perpetrated the robbery, the ones who had not been accused of it, 2 out of 3 agreed to sign an affidavit saying they recognized being among the perpetrators of that robbery and that I, Rejean Hinse, had nothing to do with it. It's obvious. You miss a lot, especially about the child. Affection you could have given or exchanged with that child and with your wife. During visits, we were talking through a glass. There was no contact possible. In 20 years of marriage, we have been the equivalent of 4 to 5 years together.
Despite his 8 years spent behind bars, Rejean did not abandon the fight. In spite of Laurent Beausoleil and the statements of 3 other robbers that exonerate him, Rejean Hinse does not obtain justice. After his release, he had to take up the battle again.
Someone who was unjustly sentenced in the 60s, sentenced to 15 years in prison, serves many years in jail before getting parole, and who, since then, claims for the governments and the concerned authorities to accept that they've made many errors, and they refuse to do it. In 2008, we had to take important legal proceedings to try to get reparation, and Mr. Hinse has the courage to pursue his debate until he obtains fair and reasonable reparation.
He doggedly tries to prove his innocence. Rejean Hinse's quest is one for justice, for him, but also for his whole family. His wife, Janine, deceased a few years ago, had seen her life broken because of that event. Despite their divorce, Rejean and Janine have always remained in touch. Their son Christian and their daughter Muriel have also lived through difficult times.
My mother admitted she told me my father had done some jail time. I was 8, 9 years old. I lived many difficult things with my father. Often the relationship was tense. I also had problems understanding him, understanding his behavior. I often felt different with him. I did not understand his gestures. I didn't understand his attitude, so it answered many questions when I learned. Even if I was very young, even if I was 8 or 9, I understood many things at that time. It brought me answers.
It really is the worst thing, from the legal point of view, that could have happened in a story in Quebec. Since 50 years, almost? In 2011, it'll be 50 years that I'm fighting this. And for 50 years, they refused my word. It simply is a denial of justice to me, and I wonder who will end up hearing me and really understanding me. Up to now, they've always tried to strangle me, to make me... Look, I was sentenced. You're a convict. You're guilty.
In Mr. Hinse's case, he suffered a broken life. Why? Because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that led him to serve 8 years in jail, to have a suspended sentence afterwards, to have to report to authorities on his whereabouts, and to maintain his innocence.
When he was in jail, he was an autonomous learner. He was there a long time, and he used his time to learn. He started reading the civil code, and he sort of became his own lawyer, taking charge and representing himself.
He knows the detail of his file like the back of his hand. He has been living it since 1961. He lives it deeply.
What touched me most about Monsieur Hinse was to see how deeply scarred he really is, how much it has eaten away at him throughout his life. It overwhelms him. Also, his need for recognition. His need for his innocence to be recognized drives him constantly. He works at it actively. I think he'll only feel truly liberated from his internal prison the day he'll be officially and publicly vindicated.
If you carefully read Mr. Hinse's file, he wrote letters to the Minister of Justice. In chronological order, he started with Mr. Trudeau, then Mr. Turner, then to Mr. Chrétien, then to Mr. Crosby, and finally to Kim Campbell. Obviously, they're all people with the exception of Crosby who became Prime Minister, but who were Minister of Justice at the time. And he did the same in Quebec. He wrote to the Ministers of Public Security, Mr. Ryan, Gilles Rémillard, Sam Elkis, Pierre-Marc Johnson, and for 30 years, the federal and the provincial governments were passing the buck to one another. We're not responsible, it's them and conversely. It's part of the reason why Mr. Hinse keeps fighting. Mr. Hinse is persistent. When you shout at the top of your lungs for 30 years, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. And when you bring the concrete evidence, such as sworn statements of people who took part in the crime, and who all say, except for one, each and every one says, Mr. Hinse did not take part. He was not in it. How can authorities refuse to see the truth of what happened at the time?
Despite his determination, nobody wants to hear him. But a letter from November 6, 1988, addressed to the Quebec Police Commission, would finally be taken seriously. That commission, after a long investigation, presents a factum finally highlighting the obvious errors made during Rejean Hinse's trial and asks the Attorney General to interfere.
He's been shouting at almost every minister, every authority since at least the 70s, and the Quebec Police Commission has supported his thesis and the inequity in 1990.
At one point, I had been fighting and taking various steps for 30 years, and suddenly, whoop, a door opens. That's what it's like, the Quebec Police Commission. They submitted an excellent report to the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Hinse has worked thoroughly, dipping in the court files, in files from the Court of Session of Peace in 1961, in the files from the Court of Quebec, in the files from the Court of Appeal, files from the Supreme Court, and obviously the criminal files of the other people involved. And we have a stack of documents, approximately half a meter thick. And just to absorb, to understand it all, it's an extraordinary job.
The federal and provincial governments only passed each other the buck. That legal back and forth finally came to an end on January 21st, 1997, when the Supreme Court of Canada, to which the case has been referred, acquits Rejean Hinse. Today, 10 years later, the government still refused to recognize Rejean Hinse's innocence despite all the evidence and the confession of the perpetrators of the robbery.
It's amazing how come the authorities, especially the Quebec ones, have not acknowledged the errors of the police units who investigated in the early 60s. Important errors, as you say, since they justified the acquittal he benefited from the Supreme Court of Canada in 1997.
I was acquitted by the Supreme Court of Canada, but for the government, an acquittal is not an acknowledgement of innocence. And that's what I've always requested, that they acknowledge that I was innocent. Not only that I am innocent, but that I should never have been accused of such a crime.
When his case went to the Supreme Court and he was acquitted, the image of my father was one of a man who did not smile. There was no joy. There was nothing in his face. Because for him, it was not enough. That's not what he wanted. It's not an acknowledgement, it's just an acquittal.
When we make a mistake, a huge one, the state should recognize it, because it's an equity and fairness matter. One of the additional reasons that should force to acknowledge these inequities when almost every other institution to which we address, such as the Quebec Court of Appeal, the Supreme Court, the Quebec Police Commission, who've acknowledged obvious errors, is to help these people deal with emotions that can only be negative.
What Mr. Hinse is looking for is acknowledgement by the authorities, by the Quebec Society, the Quebec Attorney General, the Canada Attorney General, the police authorities, that he is innocent. He wants to be exonerated. He does not want to be found not guilty because of a lack of evidence. He wants the authorities to acknowledge that there have been errors, that he was not present, that he did not take part, and that he truly is innocent.
The stage we are at now is before the court, and we who just got the case a few months ago, in a case that's lived for many years and that is very complicated. Complicated because of the number of documents and the outdated procedures. We have to tell the court that we want to make other procedures, other examinations. And eventually, we hope, sooner than later, the court will set a trial date. And if we're unable to attain an amicable agreement that suits Mr. Hinse, we will proceed as per the procedures. The bars of the mental prison in which he lives may have gotten further apart a little so that he may be able to get out once in a while. He's the one you should ask if he will be able to be entirely free. I'm doubtful. Having never lived that, we can only imagine the harm it may cause. But I'm under the impression, and I believe, that has to be validated with the other people who've been able to get, in the end, reparation or compensation for this harm, that it at least allows them to live with a certain inside peace that they haven't known since the harm was caused. It won't be complete, but it will certainly be better. Give better chances to live the last years with relative peace.
I'm a commercial litigation lawyer. I mainly work for large companies, for banks, insurance companies. It's always nice to win a case for a client. People are happy. But when you work on a case for a person like Mr. Hinse, there is an opportunity to put a smile on his face. And this is what I want, to see Mr. Hinse's smile winning his case when his innocence will be acknowledged. This is the greatest reward I can hope for.
He needs the recognition. He needs to be heard. It happened already 50 years ago in his life, and it's a subject that constantly comes back. His whole life revolves around this. It is the culminating point of his life. He did not let go. It's imprinted in him. It's the story of his life, so he cannot help always coming back to that point.
It's to have the competent authorities to finally, officially acknowledge that I was innocent, completely innocent from the theft of which I was wrongly accused. I should never, ever have been accused of such a thing.